President Xi Jinping has called for nationwide efforts to emulate the transformation of East China's Zhejiang province to build a beautiful countryside with a pleasant living environment. As urbanization and poverty alleviation continue, there is also the need to improve the quality of life for all rural residents. So what does the Zhejiang experience mean for Chinese rural development? Will the Zhejiang model be applicable in the new Chinese rural vitalization strategy? And how should tradition and modernization be balanced in national rural development? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Andy Mock, founder and managing director of Red Pagoda Resources, and Michaela Garacci, head of the economic policy program of Nottingham University in China. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. But before we get started, let's look at this.
Zhejiang has become China's first province to create thousands of beautiful villages. It is setting the bar in terms of building an alluring countryside. But just 15 years ago, there was a huge gap between the modern urban areas and the disorderly countryside. President Xi was secretary of the Zhejiang Provincial Party Committee then, and he looked at ways to narrow this gap.
This is what Xi found in the villages. Although garbage and sewage were handled well in the cities, they weren't in rural regions. Cities were looked after, but not the countryside. Xi pointed out that the government's unbalanced management was the main reason of the gap.
Xi created a dozen new departments into Provincial Party Committee. Their aim was to push the city's measures out into the countryside. A quarter of the 40,000 villages in the province were involved in a rural renovation programme launched in 2003. Nearly 1,000 of these became comprehensive, well-off demonstration villages within 5 years. And many more followed in the preceding years.
Gentlemen, other than the very unique location of Zhejiang, which is of course very close to other prosperous places like Jiangsu and Shanghai in the Changjiang River Delta region, what's special about this place? And what are the things that people like Mr. Xi Jinping should be so proud of?
Well, I think Zhejiang, in a sense, was the cradle of economic modernization in China. So I think that's one thing that makes it unique, but also I think makes it an excellent location for piloting schemes that can be plans that can be rolled out throughout China.
What do you think of the Zhejiang entrepreneurship and diligence of the locals, which I believe must have contributed enormously to the prosperity of Zhejiang?
Absolutely. We have we study in Europe the famous Wenzhou model, one of the cities in the southern parts of Zhejiang, border with Fujian. And this group of people have managed to, grow out of difficult economic situations 40 years ago into one of the most prosperous cities in China. And I'm Italian, and I see we have a lot of also of migrants from Wenzhou to Italy. Around 400,000 Wenzhounese people live in Italy, and even in Italy they continue this tradition of hard working. Maybe starting with opening restaurants, importing clothes and computers, just as it was in the 80s. And now we have sons of second generation from Wenzhou that graduate from Milan and Italy top business schools like Bocconi and others. So in such a short period of time, within one generation, from a migrant going to seek fortune, they have led the children to be almost at the top of the Italian economic society. And this is, in my view, unprecedented in the history of migration. We of course have migration in the US, but it took longer. Here we have a very strong, a very quick recognition of the skills, and like you said, the entrepreneurial spirit. In a way, wherever they go, they will be successful.
The success of the home-based small and medium-sized enterprises in Zhejiang province, I mean the township enterprises, must have contributed also to the success of maritime commerce, the export-led growth in the first stage or primary stage of the development in Zhejiang, Jiangsu and Shanghai. But I believe these small and medium-sized enterprises are facing the immediate task of transformation. from labor-intensive, low value-added business, which depend on exports, to capital-intensive and it means a very deep transformation. So what do you think of the performance of the second generation of the wealthy families? I mean, as Michaela mentioned earlier, most of them are well educated in Europe and in the United States.
Well, I think there's a couple of ways to look at this. I mean, the rise of these SMEs, relatively low value add, was a response to the economic conditions at the time. So first of all, there was an enormous opportunity for China to manufacture low-end exports, primarily for sale in the United States, but also in Europe as well. So I think at a deeper level, we can understand this as not just, I think, the business acumen of Zhejiang, the people in Zhejiang, particularly Wenzhou, but the diligence as well. So the ability to respond to the opportunities and the challenges of any particular time. So in this way, I think there will be a important transition at the enterprise level as the founding generation retires, and do the children want to carry on in the family business? And it seems like many of them don't. So I think that is indeed a challenge, but perhaps at a more profound level, I think Zhejiang really represents the entrepreneurial spirit, the diligence, and the industriousness of China in general, and that they will rise to this challenge as well.
However, in this stage of the social development or phase of the economic development, I'm afraid another aspect of the transformation concerns ideology. Now, in the first 3 decades in particular, I believe private market and non-public sector of the Chinese economy have benefited enormously, allegedly, from Deng Xiaoping's sense of pragmatism. Today, the die-hard conservatives would call the ideology of Deng Xiaoping neoliberal ideology. And that's very dangerous today. Today, the official ideology goes against capitalist ideology like liberal market economy. Central planning is tightened, SOE is tightened, is strengthened. So what do you think of the next steps of the non-public sector, the SMEs?
I think you mentioned the ideology. I am, from my personal experience, I live in Zhejiang. I teach in Nottingham, in Ningbo, and I also teach at Zhejiang in Hangzhou, and so I almost live on a daily basis. I think people in Zhejiang go beyond the ideology, and they're driven mostly by making money, like everyone, like most people in the world, and they will adapt to whatever is the decision and the plan from the central government, from the local government, just as it happened in Wenzhou many years ago. Because let's remember also Wenzhou was so successful because they were a little bit isolated because of the geography, the mountains, the fact that they were a little bit left out from the development of Anhui, where the reform started. And so the people from Wenzhou, they said, okay, we need to do something by ourselves. And this is a little bit what I see. Ningbo is the biggest cargo port in China and in the world. And so despite the challenges that we have, maybe increased tariffs, a trade war with the US or not, I see every day. Next week I'm going to visit the port of Ningbo. And I want to bring back to my European people, my experience from how the region is driven by economic objective, and it is always they're always met.
Provinces like Fujian, Guangdong in the Pearl River Delta region, and Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Shanghai in the Changjiang River Delta region are the powerhouse of China's economic development. But what about the underdevelopment in the hinterland, like Tibet, Xinjiang, Xiamen, Inner Mongolia? I mean, can the experiences of Zhejiang be applied easily in these impoverished and underdeveloped areas, the remote mountainous areas that are inhabited mostly by ethnic groups, for example?
I believe they can. I mean, because when we look at the way China's economy is developing and the trend in the global economy, it's away from reliance on natural resources, reliance on industrial production, and more based on information and knowledge. So when we look at Zhejiang and how do you extend this to other parts of China, I think technology plays a crucial role because the key input right now is intelligence as well as personal characteristics like resourcefulness, creativity, diligence.
But I'm afraid that the counter-argument would say, look at the brutal facts in the three northernmost provinces like Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning. Investment would never go beyond the Shanghai Guan because of the poor labor force, the unqualified labor force, as well as demographic changes. People are getting old there. Young people would prefer to live in the sunshine province of Hainan. So in that case, how could you expect investment in digital areas be made possible in these underdeveloped regions?
It's a great question, Yang Rui. I mean, I'm not sure exactly why Dongbei has lagged behind, but the way I understand this rural revitalization program is, of course, external investment will play a role, but it's more about empowering people at the grassroots level to develop their own future. And we look at some of these Taobao villages, and I don't know if there are any enormously successful ones in Dongbei, but certainly throughout the country. Someone figures out how to make sofas and sell them on Taobao, and next thing you know, 6 months, a year later, there's hundreds, thousands of people doing this, and this has become the Taobao sofa village. So I think that government can provide the policies, the infrastructure, but at the end of the day, whether we're talking about Dongbei or Tibet, it really does boil down to the individual initiative of the people.
And what do you think of the farming land?
Well,
farmers would use their farming land, namely their properties, to enrich their life, to get rich. But the land cannot be sold for commercial reasons.
Not yet. We are looking at reforms. So this has been, China, let's remember that China is a big country with 1.3 billion people, so reforms need to take their own speed, and we have seen very great improvement. On land reforms, I traveled to Guizhou a few years ago to do some analysis, and what we're looking at is that we know in China that every member of the rural citizen is allocated about 700 square meters of land, about 1,000 square meters each. People do not have rights to sell, but they have rights to use. In the early 80s, this rights of use was only for 15 years. And then close to the expiry, the government extended the lease for free for an additional 30 years. Now we are at 45 in total, so we're coming almost close to the expiry of the second term. And most likely there will be a further extension. So while from a legal point of view, farmers do not have the right of ownership, they have the right of use. And over the last few years, we're also seeing farmers renting their plot of land to other people. You mentioned people from Liaoning, from Dongbei, from Shenyang, because heavy industrial province like in the northeast was heavily hit by the financial crisis, and so people rightly, like you said, moved to the urban areas. And so what happens? The land was left uncultivated and maybe not really used in an efficient way. So they did try to reallocate the land. So people who moved to the city handed over the piece of land to those who were left behind. And in a way, this is a very good way to make the average productivity go up, because one of the problems of Chinese rural economy is that the low scale of the operation, as I said, 1,000 square meter per head, is not enough to have economies of scale. And now when people move to the city, the land is reallocating people, the average land per capita grows. We will not reach the size of the US. When you fly over the Midwest, you see hundreds of kilometers of cornfield. But in China, we're getting to a higher scale. And let's not forget, the point number 8 of the China manufacturing plan is about improving the agriculture machinery, because other than having the bottom sorted, so the average land, you need to put hardware on top. The software is already there because the farmers have the experience, and if we get to solve the issue of land ownership or land usage and combined with the improvement in the machinery, which is still a little bit backward, I think the countryside will be prosperous. One number, even now, the average income for the average farmer has grown by 100 times since 1978. In 1978, the average farmer was making 130 renminbi per year, now 13,000, 100 times. I don't know any country that has managed to make the income of all the citizens grow by 100 times of the size of China, because when we talk about the tiger miracle of Asia, it's easy when you improve things in Singapore, even Malaysia, Vietnam, but when you do it for 1.3 billion people, when a fifth of the world is raised from 100 renminbi to 13,000, this to me is unprecedented economic and social success. And when we do forecast, you ask what's going to happen in the future, we must not forget what has happened in the past.
In the future, I believe we'll have a growing momentum in the process of urbanization. This is what we call the rural-urban integration schemes. We have had some pilot programs in Chongqing, Chengdu, and other developed cities, urban areas in Zhejiang, for example. Now, what about eventually the issue of a household registration system, the hukou system? It means migrant workers can be provided with equal access to education and medical care. And on the other hand, children in their millions have been left behind. The elderly people, lonely hearts of the housewives who have also been left behind by their husbands, who seek job opportunities in the prosperous urban areas. Now these issues are cropping up very quickly on the horizon. So what do you think of the challenges?
Well, I think it's important to recognize, too, that the goal is not 100% urbanization in China. And I think that an important...
However, Mr. Xi Jinping did demand zero tolerance for poverty. All of the people,
yes.
I mean, those who are still living under the poverty line have to be lifted
yes.
By the year, in 3 years' time.
Yeah. And my understanding is that's well on track. This poverty alleviation goal is likely to be met. But I think the issue here, though, it's not 100% urbanization. And Xi Jinping, I think, in some ways was very prescient in seeing that these problems that China faced, writ small in Zhejiang, in improving the social services for those in the rural areas in Zhejiang. Because one of the main challenges facing China today really is not economic development per se, but unbalanced economic development. So I think one of the most important things for this rural revitalization scheme to be successful is to make sure that there are adequate, if not excellent, social services, whether that's schools, sanitation, other of the softer services as well. So while there still is a trend towards urbanization, there will still be good opportunities, whether that's selling things on Taobao.
But all of these projects would cry for money. You need to have cash. You need to have a public spending, a big enough amount to be provided. However, we spend so much money on military build-up. We spend so much money on maintaining social stability. Do you think it means more consumers will have to be taxed? More enterprises would have to be taxed?
No, I don't think so, because let's remember China spends also a lot of money in research and development. 2.8% of GDP goes into research, double what we do in Italy, and higher than what we do on the European Union as average, higher than Germany too. So this has been going on for a number of years, and this is not money. I make a joke when I teach finance to my students. One thing is spending money, and the other thing is investing.
In the United States, it's a matter of how to save money.
How to spend the money.
In China, it's the other way around.
The Chinese save a little bit, not as much as people think. The Chinese people save, but not as much. There's also a misperception. Chinese people consume, and that's why consumption grows, and that's why GDP grows at 7%.
We consume and we spend in Italy.
And you're welcome to do it.
Because of your crazy fashion industry in Milan.
That's true. Which, however, unfortunately, Ray, although the media reports as a nice thing, it does contribute very little to our GDP. You know,
Ooh.
Ferrari and other bags, handbags and shoes, they are very, glamorous things, but for the economy of Italy, it's just a little bit. It does help to create the image, but financially, it represents very little. In fact, we export to China machinery, boring stuff that no one knows about, rather than the fashionable things like your nice suits that you're wearing today.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That's very nice.
But you mentioned the Chongqing model. What is the Chinese government doing? Very, very smart. Instead of having people from the West moving to Shanghai, and so you have to travel for 2,000 kilometers, stay in Shanghai the whole year, go back only once a year for Chuanjie, and then leave the family behind, they are doing urbanizing the West. So Chongqing, Chengdu, Guiyang, other cities in Guizhou, Anshun, and others are now urbanizing locally. So the farmers from the poor areas of the West, they don't need to come to Shanghai 2,000, 3,000 kilometers.
That creates yet another problem of labor shortage in the prosperous Pearl River Delta region and the Changjiang River Delta region. So
Better. So with less labor, China moves up to service, which needs less labor. And so the labor shortage that the Zhejiang will experience, because people will stay in Guiyang, in Guizhou, and so they can see. But the important thing is the social. Living near, if you move from a rural area to a city which is 100 kilometers away, every month you can go back to see your family. And that is the important thing that China is doing very well. Now, if the Zhejiang loses labor force, doesn't matter. It will readapt even faster and move up the value chain up to the service, which requires less labor and more software.
One thing that characterizes the unique national conditions of China is that every passing day, 1.4 billion people would have to be fed and fed properly with enough food. Today, as part of the trade war between the United States and China, we have to ban or increase drastically the tax on soybeans that we import from the United States. And that means we have to develop the idea of national security based on sufficient food supply from our own homeland. Today, with the dynamic process of urbanization, do you think the shrinkage of farming land has posed a serious challenge? Or do you think with the advancement of technology in the limited farming land, we can have more agricultural produce to increase the productivity of agricultural production? What are your thoughts?
Well, my understanding is that Chinese food security is not based on relying on domestic production, but really is an integrated global economy. So whether the soybeans or the sorghum comes from the United States, from Latin America, other parts of the world, in a way doesn't matter. But I think this is why also China is committed to an open, fair, integrated trading system. Because I think China does recognize that even if it were physically possible to meet all of its food needs domestically, that just from an economic theory perspective, that doesn't make sense. So that China's path towards food security is not just relying on one country, but ensuring that there is a viable, effective global trading system.
What do you think of national food security strategy? I believe that's also an important part of the vitalization strategy.
Very important, because I agree on the economics argument that you specialize on what you do better and you let soybeans be grown in Brazil and the US.
And perhaps in Ukraine.
And in Ukraine, yeah. Which, by the way, China owns a lot of land of. And
Far East Siberia of Russia, indeed, where you see so many Chinese farmers.
Moving from Heilongjiang, from Neimonggu, crossing the border.
Marrying local Russian girls.
Good, two birds with one stone.
And there is a strong voice from Moscow that is very skeptical about the growing presence of the Chinese in the Far East Siberia. But just go ahead.
No, but the land is abundant in Siberia, and also, but the food security is important because China can, a normal country could rely on importing from another country. If I was in a small European country, I know I cannot. I can rely on the other 170 countries. But China represents 1/5 of the world. And that makes everything a little bit more challenging. And so much more China needs to do it domestically. Now, the soya beans tax, even China really, even 20%, 25% is not going to be a lot of money. We're talking about tens of billion dollars that the government can quickly reallocate. The budget is big in China. We have an economy in excess of 12 trillion US dollars. So this trade war with the US is really very little money that even when you tax it, does not really change the propensity to consume of the customers. Even because what do we do with soya? We do two things. We make oil and we give it to animals to feed.
Right.
And for pork, yes. Yeah. So it's not eaten. It's not very little is consumed directly by humans. So the large quantity, China imports 5 times what it produces. So it produces 1/5 of what it needs, and that will need to change little by little. But soya is not the main thing. We have rice, we have corn, and we have other products, and we have pork that China is.
Have you guys thought of yet another embarrassing problem the process of urbanization faces? For example, countryside, much of it has become the dumping ground for garbage, and therefore white trash or waste, industrial wastes from prosperous cities may be a very serious hazard to the health of the farmers. What should be the solution?
Well, I think clearly, this is partly a developmental problem in that, don't forget, it was 30, 40 years ago that most people in China were poor and worried about physical survival. Mm-hmm. So because of this rapid advancement, now China is in a position to address these problems. And I think this is, again, I think President Xi's ability to see, look ahead and anticipate some of these problems, in that rural revitalization is not just about economic development, but also maintaining a beautiful physical environment and a social environment.
And that perhaps gives rise to the challenge for the second generation of the home-based SME enterprises. But these guys, they love the lifestyle of the middle class in Italy, in France, in Spain, in the United States. So they hate to live in countryside surrounded by the white trash, the industrial wastes. And therefore, do you think legacy of the small businesses would be a problem?
But this is a little problem, but again, already 3 years ago it's been addressed. We are going green. China is doing, again, I cannot stop thinking, every time I talk to my Italian counterparts, European counterparts, I always have to bring numbers, because only numbers give the magnitude, can show the magnitude of what China is doing. Electric vehicles, investment in clean energy. China is going to have 35 million electric vehicles by 2025, so in the next 7 years. And this is n times more what the rest of the world is going to do. China is buying lithium and cobalt around the world to make the electric batteries. Coal mines are very dirty, are being shut. The energy efficiency, so the energy per GDP is improving. China went to Paris as the champion of global warming, of fighting global warming, more than the US and Japan. And this thing of the garbage in the countryside.
Right, low carbon development has been prioritized on the agenda of Mr. Xi Jinping. The last question is about the labor shortage. Yes, the Chinese authorities have relaxed its grip on the one-child policy, allowing families, young couples to have more than 2 children. And yet, China's getting old before we get rich, as I said over and over. So do you think rural families that can have more than 2 children in most cases, like in Tibet, Xinjiang in particular, would help the rural areas to develop their industry, which will increasingly rely on leadership of digital technology?
Certainly, but I think I would also question the premise that there is a labor shortage, because at the same time, there are labor shortages in the coastal Tier 1 cities, but also there's also a lot of concern about the disruption that artificial intelligence and robotics is going to deliver in terms of making, I've seen some estimates that 50% of white-collar jobs will be eliminated by AI-type automation. So I think, at least to me, the jury's still out on that question.
Yes, indeed. AI, or the use of robots along the assembly line, would be a silver lining in the darkest cloud. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has assumed the leadership one way or another in Japan. Well, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.